Donc, bienvenue à tous. Tout le monde.
Welcome, everyone. Everybody in the room and everybody online. We're going to be starting the session this afternoon. And as we say, we're going to start with a little trip. This morning, we talked about the situation in France. And for this session, we're going abroad, first of all, to Canada. And then we're going to be heading to Australia to see how easements are managed there.
We invited them not at the best time for them to speak at a conference. They're at 7 in the morning and 9 at night. So thank you very much, Marie-Michèle and Victoria, to join us. So we will start with a presentation of Marie-Michèle about the situation in Canada, and then we continue about the situation in Australia. I would organize a session that I give a short introduction on our speakers, then they will give their presentations. We can take some clarification questions, and after the two presentations, we will have a larger Q&A session where you also can ask your questions. So, we will start with Marie-Michèle Rousseau-Clair. Marie-Michèle holds a master's degree in project development and management in land use planning. She has a graduate diploma in management and sustainable development. She has 15 years of experience in developing and promoting the best practices in conservation, and currently she is responsible for developing strategic conservation orientations for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So I think it's fair to say that we have one of the country's leading conservationists with us now. So Marie-Michèle, if it's okay for you, you can share your screen. Yes, perfectly, that works.
I should be able to see it now, thanks. Bonjour, c'est un grand plaisir pour moi d'être...
It is a pleasure for me to be here with you. These slides are in French, but I'm going to give the presentation in English to simplify things.
It's a real pleasure for me to be with you today to be speaking about our experience in Canada. Try to give a bit of a journey of what the situation is across the country, but I will focus on what I believe is probably the closest example that may apply to France in particular. So bear with me as we try to move the slides. Yes. So in Canada, we use a broad term to refer to those legal agreements, and we call them conservation agreements. And it's simply because our, jurisdiction context playing with three different legal tools across the country. So out west in British Columbia, we call them covenants. In the central provinces, as well as the ones in the Maritimes or out east, they're called conservation easements. And the covenants and the easements are, coming out of common law, which is a different legislation system than the civil laws that are in effect in Quebec. And so they're called servitudes. So today for the presentation, I'll be focusing mostly on the real servitudes that are in Quebec, but happy to take also any questions later about what are the differences across the country. So what's the origin? I think it's very important, especially in the Canadian context, to kind of understand where they're coming from. As I mentioned, the province of Quebec is governed by civil laws, or we refer to it here in Quebec as the Civil Code, which is a series of principles, in law. And essentially, it's the Civil Code or the civil laws refer to any servitudes, so not simply conservation servitudes, as an encumbrance onto a property that is called a servient land in favor of a dominant land, in other words, of another property. And by this encumbrance on the land, the owner of that property has to kind of respect or comply to certain land use in order to achieve the objective of that servitude. So there's nothing more than that in the civil code that is specific to conservation servitudes. So it really becomes a matter of interpreting those principles to make them applicable in the conservation context, which I'll for sure explain. But the key notion here, and I'll cover them a little bit later, but it comes with risks and limitation because it is an interpretation. So in other words, there are no enabling legislations in the province of Quebec, which is a key nuance compared to other provinces in our country. So when we deal with conservation servitudes, there's based on that previous slide, that previous statement, there's 5 components that must be in place for a servitude or a conservation servitude even to exist. So since I've referred to a servient land and a dominant land, it does require 2 pieces of two different properties. They must be owned by different landowners. And the servitude holder, so the agency that is responsible for managing the conservation servitude has to be the owner of what we call the dominant land. The land must be, that's an interesting concept, but the 2 lands must be somewhat adjacent. And it's adjacent in the sense that they have to be sufficient or close enough for the service to be provided from one land to the other. So we cannot say that on one end of the province there's a servient land and the dominant land resides at the completely opposite side of the province. We have to make sure that the service can be provided. So for example, if we're protecting wetlands or water, not only do they need to be close enough, but they have to be in the right water flow. So if we protect the dominant land, usually it has to be downstream and not upstream of the servient land. So as I just alluded to, there has to be a service provided between the servient land and the dominant land, which means, if I continue with my water example, by restricting uses on the servient land, this help enhance or it contributes to protecting the conservation inherent values of the dominant land, which is why the location and where they are and their geographic location is important. And last but not least, the owner of the servient land has to accept to meet certain obligation or more frequently accept to not do certain activities. So for example, it could be not doing certain activities in the riparian area of a river in my water example, or it could be not tree cutting or building in certain areas of the property, but it's always in favor or in service of the conservation values situated on the dominant land. So I think I've covered those 2 things, but just to recap, the primary kind of elements that are really needed is really this notion of a service and the neighboring or adjacent. And in both cases, the servitudes in Quebec, they can be registered in perpetuity, so they can last. So both the service as well as the notion of adjacent have to last or be able to exist and persist through time. All of that, I just again reiterating that this is all an interpretation of the code, so there's no enabling legislation which can cause some challenges. So a little illustration of how those things can be even geographically or spatially arranged. On this map, you can see in the center you have like a polygon, I'll call it this way, that is in green, which is the dominant land. We don't really see it clearly on the map, but it's very close to a summit with very specific flora and fauna that are found exclusively on that summit. And this property was very subject to forest activities, recreational activities, cottages. It was very used by the community. But in order to protect the summit's characteristics, which if you want to see what they can look like, the remainder of the property, so what is in white, that's called the servient land. Some restrictions were put onto the servient land areas in order to protect the summit. The Nature Conservancy of Canada is the owner of the green area, so we do own the dominant land in fee simple ownership. And what's in white is owned by a different organization, but they are subject to the restrictions that we have put onto the property. What you see there on the map is only for Quebec, but it gives you an extent of the protected and conserved area network in Quebec. Right now in this province, there's over 75,000 hectares that are under protection status. And I'd say slightly over 10,000 hectares are protected via a real conservation servitude. So what I've mentioned. So it's a fairly significant tool that's being used in Quebec. If ever you're aware of some statistics around the world, the United States are probably a little bit more utilizing similar tools like the conservation easements, but it still has grown over the years in Canada and in Quebec. I would say even in the rest of the provinces, the ratio of servitudes compared to other mechanism remains quite similar. So I've kind of mentioned some of the risks and obstacle that comes with conservation servitudes. So obviously there's a legal risk, and all land trusts and conservation organization in Quebec are quite aware of it. But because it is an interpretation, we have to be extremely diligent in how those conservation agreements or the deed themselves are written. Because if they're challenged one day, that means that there's a potential that all of them will become challenged, depending on what is the nature of the challenge, of course. But if it's because, for example, someone is challenging the fact that they're not close enough or that the service being provided, it's really about those two elements. It's either that they're not close enough in order to support the service being provided, and or that the service itself that's being targeted is not even existing or is not possible to be provided. So there's that's probably the big associated with a lack of enabling legislation, is that it could be challenged in court. It has not been to date, I should mention. The other piece is about when we all think about international or domestic targets for biodiversity protection, so frequently referenced as 30 by 30 targets. There's always this question of whether conservation servitudes or any easements for that matter will count, or there may be possible incompatible uses to ensure the protection of in situ biodiversity. because obviously the restrictions applied onto the surrogate lands are not protecting everything. They're aimed at protecting very specific elements. So there's potential question about whether that's a protected area or not. Also, the long-term, I guess, efficiency or even its effectiveness to some extent is not only limited by the fact that there's only few restrictions that apply, but because it's an interpretation, it's an agreement between two landowners, but the restrictions apply onto the land. Well, the surrogate land can be transferred to another generation of landowner, which they might not have the same interests or appetite for conservation, and they might have a very different vision for their property, which may cause some additional challenges to make sure that the second generation landowners comply with the restrictions. It's also a case with easements or covenants in Canada. We see that second generation landowner don't necessarily have the same level of buy-in or commitment, but sometimes the fact that they have enabling legislations kind of help with managing that situation. So I'll go quickly with kind of the lesson learned, again, across the country, but definitely applicable for the Quebec context. I would say the first one is really to adhere to standard and practices for conservation. There are key elements, for example, ensuring that we have a clear objectives and purposes, which can be translated into like describing the service that's being provided and being super clear about it. It's about making sure we have baseline documentation report that also apply to the servitude context. It's making sure that say what you mean clearly, having definitions, having precise restrictions that are, and really challenging ourselves with saying, are those restrictions clearly related to our purpose? Will they make a difference? Because again, the risk of being challenged in court being very prohibitive in Quebec, this becomes a clear kind of way of a backstop or ensuring that we do our own due diligence. And of course, compliance monitoring. Without a proper monitoring to make sure that those landowners are complying or fulfilling their obligation, then the only thing we have between the Nature Conservancy of Canada and a landowner is a piece of paper. And so to have true conservation being done, we do have to ensure do the follow-up and the monitoring. And so all of that helps with credibility of both the tool, the conservation servitude as a tool, but any conservation organization holding those tools, it helps with enhancing the protection of the conservation values. It helps with meeting some obligation, but also it reinforces relationship with different landowners. If we're present on the land, we're more likely to know when there's going to be a change in landowner and to help accompany the new landowner and understand why this tool is important. I still, even without the risk or notwithstanding the risks and challenging that are applicable to this tool, I still believe it's an incredible way of achieving conservation in very specific cases and context. So I think it's still something. It's still an important tool in our toolbox. And that's it. It's very quick overview of what it is, what are the challenges, and how to kind of overcome it. Happy to take clarification question. Otherwise, to you, Anne-Sophie.
Thank you very, very much, Marie-Michèle. I hope you just heard the applause. There was a lot of applause for you.
Thank you.
I think you did extremely well explaining this super technical topic in only 10 minutes, or a bit more, because we're a bit late in our timing. So I said I would take 1 or 2 clarification questions, but I will take them after the second presentation, so we have the whole discussion. together. So then we can move on to Victoria. So we go now to Australia. And Victoria Marles, she served as the CEO of the Trust for Nature in Victoria, Australia for 23 years until she retired from the position at the end of 2022. As the leader of the Trust for Nature, Victoria helped oversee the protection of tens of thousands acres of land using conservation covenants, which are Australia's version of the conservation easements. And her work focuses strongly on the conservation of biodiversity and on landscape restoration to address and reverse widespread loss of native habitats. So Victoria, I will ask you to share your screen, check if everything works. We can see the slide, so.
Okay, so you see a slide that says Habitat Forever?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. All right, well, my apologies, everybody, for not succeeding in sharing my screen. And thank you very much to the organisers for doing that. And thank you also for inviting me to tell you a little bit about Australia and how we do things in Australia. So I'll be focusing mainly on the instrument, the tool that we have for protecting high-value biodiversity conservation on private land in Australia, and that's what we call the Conservation Covenant. Next slide, please. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about just running through the purpose of the presentation. So just checking you're with me with the slides.
Can you change the slide, please? Yeah, we can see the next slide. I'm sorry, Victoria.
I'm really sorry. So basically, I'm going to introduce the concept of the Conservation Covenant, which is a legal concept in Australia, talk about its key features, its origins, its developments, what I think we have achieved in Australia and the lessons learned. And I'm going to begin really by just giving you a very short snapshot of Australia, if you like, and our legal system so that you understand how this works there. And I thought I was asked to provide a few pictures. So I thought you might like that picture of the kookaburra. And that kookaburra came to visit me, and that kookaburra is on the front porch of my house. So don't you think it's cute? Anyway, next slide, please. So the main thing about Australia is it is very big. It's roughly the same size as contiguous USA, but instead of having a population of around 350 million people, it's got a population of around 26 million people. So 26 million people attempting to look after a land that is very, very big. It's obviously a land that's very dry, very old, very flat, very red internally. And if you have a look at it, and again, you imagine that it's roughly the same size as contiguous USA, it has a very long coastline. And the land, because it's so old, because it's so dry, the land itself is very fragile. And you can see all of that in the bottom picture of Australia. Around the edge is really the green area, and you can just see how much of the middle of Australia is extremely dry and extremely hot. The slide above is a slide I really wanted to include because that is the slide that represents Indigenous Australia, the ownership of Australia by the Indigenous traditional owner clans pre-European settlement. And more increasingly, we are factoring in the interests, if you like, of Indigenous Australia in the work that we are doing with our protection on publicly owned and on privately owned land. Next slide, please. So these are just a few snapshots, really, to give you a sense of the coastline. So we've got two coastlines there. I thought I would include. The middle picture is really the picture of the eastern coastline of Australia, and you can see just from the slide that really a lot of our coastline is not inhabited or cultivated, and that's the Pacific Ocean, and then the bottom was the Southern Ocean, and really nothing stands between effectively the Southern Ocean and the Antarctic. And the next slide. And the next slide is a series of pictures of internal Australia. And again, you'll be able to see next. Yes, that's right. So Central Australia, which is, for those of you who have been lucky enough to go there, you will know that it is a wonderful landscape. You can see in the bottom left-hand slide just how flat Central Australia is. You can also see how old it is and how low the vegetation is and how red it is. And as I say, if you're lucky enough to go, you might have even encountered some of the wonderful inland flora and fauna, including dingoes. Okay, next slide. Now, Australia's legal system, we are what's called a federation of 6 states and 2 territories. I don't really need to worry about the territories, but essentially the main thing is, again, I suppose, similar to Canada, similar to the USA. There are 6 state governments and 1 federal government, 1 national government. We're a common law country, and relevantly for this presentation, property law, or covenanting law, if you like, resides with the states. So it is the states that make enabling legislation about how we can protect biodiversity on private land in Australia. However, it is the federal government, the national government, that is the signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And that is relevant because the national government has a very big interest in how we meet, how Australia targets under the convention, the 30 by 30 targets. And so even though it doesn't create enabling legislation, which allows covenants or other form of protective instruments, the national government does create programs and incentives for private landowners around the country to enter into these covenants, even though the law for entering into covenants is state-based law. In Australia, we have different land tenures. That means different ways in which the land is owned or held. So we have Crown land, land that is owned by the government. We have leasehold land, which is land that is owned by the government but is leased for, let's say, over 100 years to leaseholders, and that the leaseholders might be a variety of different sorts of leaseholders. Very relevantly, we also have now Indigenous protected areas, and you will remember the slide I just showed you before about Australia and how Central Australia is very dry. A lot of that land is now owned by, or what we call, Indigenous protected areas. And we also have lots of other types of protected areas, including privately protected areas, and conservation covenants are the main tool for creating privately protected areas. The slide that I'm showing you there shows the different types of protected areas that are recognised by our national government for the purposes of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Now I can see that the slide has moved on, so I will as well. Thinking a bit about the impact of covenants and protection agreements. So when I use the term covenant, I'm referring to a legal instrument that in a sense sits over the land, that permanently protects that land and the biodiversity values on that land, and also contributes to Australia's commitment under the Convention on Biological Diversity. In Australia, there are around 6,000 conservation agreements or covenants. I mean, really, covenants are a form of legal agreement, so I am using both of those terms. There are around 6,000 of those over private land, and together we estimate, and it's only an estimate, that they protect around 10 million hectares in Australia, and that's across the whole of Australia. That means, if you think about it, that privately protected areas, or those areas protected by conservation covenants or other forms of permanent agreement, are managed by thousands of different landowners in Australia. Probably around 6,000 or thereabouts different landowners in Australia are owning and managing privately protected areas. And this includes farmers, it includes dedicated environmentalists, it includes land conservancies, and it includes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There are now quite a lot of traditional owner corporations in Australia which own land and which have some form of protection over them. I should say that in Australia, Indigenous protected areas are increasing in number and increasing, obviously, in the land that they're protecting. Okay, so that's the big picture. Now what I'd like to do is talk a little bit more about what the Conservation Covenant actually looks like. So the next slide, please.
Victoria, sorry to interrupt. You can continue with all the slides, but just to mention, to speed up a little bit so we can have some questions afterwards.
Thank you. Okay, so a Conservation Covenant, a permanent registered agreement on title which is legally binding. It is a voluntary agreement between any landowner, it could be me, and a covenanting body which is given that power by an enabling legislation. And in Victoria, that is an organisation called Trust for Nature. The restrictions, what it does is create a number of restrictions, and are very much like the ones that Marie-Michèle talked about. If there's a conservation covenant on your land, it means that you can't remove native vegetation, you can't plant non-native vegetation, you can't have non-native animals, so you can't have cats, for example. You can't subdivide the land, you can't intensively graze the land or alter any water flows, and you can't undertake recreational activities on it. Basically, the design of the covenant is negotiated between the covenanting organisation, the one that is given that power to covenant by our legislation, and every covenant is accompanied by a management plan which sets out how the landowner needs to look after the land. Because it sits on title, it means that the land can be sold or passed to new owners because it sits now in perpetuity. The origins of the Conservation Covenant, and that's the next slide, please, they happened in around 1984 in Australia, and it happened in the state of Victoria which is the slide, and you can see that's marked in red. It's down the bottom in the southeastern part of Australia. And the government of Victoria created enabling legislation, given an organisation called Trust for Nature the power to enter into conservation covenant agreements with private landowners. And they've done that. And there's about 1,600 private conservation covenants in the state of Victoria alone. After that happened in Victoria, it then started to happen around the rest of Australia. And basically, the federal government now has what it calls a program to approve these conservation covenant programs created by the states for the purposes of federal income tax exemptions. They wanted to create some incentives to encourage people to enter into covenants. The challenges, well, I should say without repeating it, that a lot of the challenges are very similar to the challenges that Marie-Michèle outlined. But essentially, the biggest challenge that is faced right now is that if we think about biodiversity, what we need to do in Australia, and you can picture how big Australia is, we need to really be protecting land at a landscape scale. Yet the land is owned by individual landowners, and they don't own that land at a landscape scale. So the really big challenge for private agreements is how to get scale, particularly in really big countries where what you have to do is protect whole landscapes. So that's one of the biggest things, is to encourage landowners and landowners who have land next to each other to protect it with covenants so that we're getting that landscape scale sense. The next thing is that another really big challenge is how to create incentives for landowners to do this. In Australia, unlike Canada and unlike the USA, there are really no meaningful financial incentives for entering into covenants. And that's been the case for nearly 40 years. It's really been a philanthropic activity. It's been the sort of thing that dedicated environmentalists are wanting to do and prepared to do. But currently, I'm very happy to say that there are more programs being rolled out which pay landowners to enter into these covenants because government is wanting to obviously protect more land, and seeing that if we want to meet our obligations under the Convention on Biological Diversity, they will have to create more incentives. But really, still in Australia, compared to other common law countries, there's very limited incentives. The final challenge would be that the legal instrument needs to evolve. It's there to protect intact, what we call native vegetation, but now it needs to evolve so that it can protect ecosystem restoration activities. And it can protect climate adaptation objectives, understanding that the land is going to change over 100 years. The covenant needs to make sure it's not too restrictive and too rigid. Finally, it absolutely needs to evolve so that we can, in Australia, protect on private land cultural and heritage values and use. I finish off with a slide, which is a picture of a conservation covenant property in a place called Wedderburn, which is in Victoria. And so next slide, please. And you'll just simply see that it definitely protects native vegetation. There is no grazing, there's no livestock, there's nothing on that except intact biodiversity. And finally, next slide, the end from me, and thank you very much. And the last slide is actually
Yeah. Well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. We just lost you at the last sentences, so I don't know if you're still hearing us.
Yes,
Perfect. Perfect.
Hear you?
Yeah, good. So even with the technical issues, it's still amazing that you could join us from the other side of the world. So we have some time now for some questions. I had many questions myself, but I will first open the floor to you. Are there any questions in the room? If I can ask you, if possible, to ask your question in English, otherwise we will translate it.
Hi. Hello, I was wondering, in the case of Canada, if the servant property is not necessarily, if I understood it well, the servant property is not necessarily a legal entity with some kind of legitimacy in the biodiversity conservation or scientific authority. Thank you.
Yes, a great question and great understanding. That is exactly the case. The only conservation authority involved in the establishment of a conservation servitude in Quebec is the owner of the dominant property. So in our case, it would be the Nature Conservancy of Canada. The owner of the servant land can literally be anybody. It could be the government. It could be a private individual. It could be a corporation. It could be conservation-minded groups, if you will. But there's no requirements in that matter. Yeah, great question.
Thank you.
So there are more questions coming from the room.
On a vu ce matin des...
I'm asking the question in French. We saw that there are certain protection contracts with private parties, and they do a conservation. They have these easements with a view to saving their habitat. And this is thanks to certain financial incentives. So, do you have some sort of constraints in return for compensation, that you do your easement in return for compensation? So, is that motivation enough to go for it?
Easements for compensation, conservation easements for compensation. So the question is, do you also have these type of easements for compensation?
Start. The context, okay, let me backtrack. Because in Quebec, I'll focus on the Quebec context for a second. Because there's no specific legislation that kind of gives some rules and boundaries for the use of the tool, the context in which it is applied it is sort of doesn't really matter. So it can be used in the context of compensation, although there are lots of discussion and conversation around how much is enough. And it has not, the servitude itself has not really been used in that context because of the different challenges. How long should the compensation be? How big? Quantifying the impact. Although on the financial incentive portion, one clarification or elements that maybe in contrary to Australia, we do have, I guess, additional financial mechanisms that are possible other than the donation of the servitude, which can be compensated via a tax receipt or a straight purchase of the servitude by the dominant landowner. So we don't own the land, we own the servitude. So there's a financial incentive, but we also have other potential incentive It's a federal program managed by the federal government of Canada, and it's called the Ecological Gift Program. And it essentially, in a nutshell, it gives additional tax incentive, for example, exemption on capital gain. So that's the primary kind of tax incentive, not necessarily related to compensation.
Victoria, do you want to add to it?
Yes, so compensation is not a term that we generally use in the context of conservation covenants, or for that matter, any form of agreement that permanently protects the land. So if I've understood the question correctly, what I can say is that I have to go back, I guess. There are not very many tax, if you like, incentives or compensations for people to enter into these agreements. But increasingly, a bit like what's just been described in Canada, there are both state and federal programs for, in effect, purchasing from the landowner certain management actions and maybe protection actions that are then secured by a permanent agreement on title, which is probably going to be a conservation covenant. So the federal government has just brought in a program called the Nature Repair Market. They are really wanting to create a market where private landowners will be paid to undertake certain activities, which might be restoration activities or might be simply protection of high quality native vegetation, and the states are doing the same kind of thing. I don't really know if that is what is meant by compensation in this context, because that's not a word that we really use in Australia. I don't know if the word means offsetting.
It should be translated by offsetting. So it's more offsetting than compensation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you, Victoria. Marie-Michèle, was very interesting. I'm representing the European Landowners Organization, so we are part of this project, and we are really interested about this. Maybe I can be more on the former question. I think there is a confusion between the French word compensation and offsetting. So maybe it was not clear. That's why I think compensation can be part, but I think it was offsetting in the sense of the French term. So I think that's where is the confusion. But otherwise, I had another question, and it's mostly on the political sphere, since I'm working on the political aspect. Victoria, you mentioned it's contributed to the 30 by 30 targets. How do you do that? Because is there any monitoring how the states can, report on what is done on privately protected area? I guess there is a level of monitoring that's why they can report back, and maybe in Quebec it's existing already. Are you contributing also via those kind of tools to the international targets? Thank you.
Yes, so in Australia the national government has a database, and again you'll remember that slide that I showed that had the different, which was called our National Reserve System target, that has different types of protected areas that our federal government has determined that they will include in their reporting to the Convention on Biological Diversity for the purposes of meeting 30 by 30. And they do include conservation covenants and other in perpetuity agreements on title. They need to meet certain requirements in order for the federal government to include them. And the federal government has accredited a number of state government covenanting programs, and that includes the program in the state of Victoria, for example. monitoring has to be part of that program. What I suppose, and I'm contrasting Australia to the USA here, really. I don't know enough about other jurisdictions to be confident, but in Australia, the enabling legislation gives the power to enter into covenants to statutory entities, even though those entities might be not for profit. I know it's getting a bit technical here. So in Victoria, Trust for Nature is the only organisation that has the power under the enabling legislation to enter into agreements with landholders. So there are not a lot of bilateral agreements between different parties in Australia. There are usually statutory entities which enter into these agreements with landowners. That probably gives our federal government more, I suppose it makes the accreditation of the program probably more straightforward because there are fewer entities. But it really is the federal government that has determined that they believe that these programs have adequate stewardship and monitoring in order to meet the requirements for determining them as protected areas under the CBD.
Thank you, Victoria.
Yes. So in Quebec, or Canada, it's generally similar in the sense that the database for protected and conserved area is managed federally, so at the federal government level, and the different conservation entity can submit their data directly. And so that can be just like the Nature Conservancy, we can submit our data directly, or also the different provincial legislation can submit their data. So the private effort, and when I say private, I mean like the governance type, just like the Nature Conservancy of Canada, definitely we count towards those targets. As part of that central registry, there's some obviously guidance for determining what counts and how to make sure it counts. And when it comes to conservation servitudes, there's one specific element that is, can be debated, and it's about whether there are or not incompatible land uses for the protection of in situ biodiversity, so the biodiversity found on that property. And that really becomes this question of do all conservation servitudes provide a sufficient level of protection to ensure that all biodiversity found on the property is protected. And so I think it's a matter of almost case by case, where depending on the different organization and the different projects, they decide or not to submit the project. In Quebec, for the government of Quebec, the provincial government has established a sort of a validation tool that is called nature reserves. And so whether it's fee simple properties owned by a conservation organization, servitude, so applying on someone else's land, they can almost vet the conservation values and designate those lands and reserves. And for them, if you get that designation, they consider that the criteria are met and make sure that those are fully recognized in the domestic kind of accounting. So that's it's almost like a double designation, which isn't perfect, but that's one approach that is in place in Quebec.
And I could just add something to, you've reminded me of something I could add to what I said before, which is that, for example, in the state of Victoria, all conservation covenants have the final approval by our Minister for Environment. So they are not simply an agreement between Trust for Nature and a private landowner. They are an agreement, but it needs to meet sufficient standards for the Minister for the Environment to approve it. So it has that added, I suppose, layer, if you like. They aren't perfect, let me say, and I think there would still be discussions inside Australia about whether the actual protection that a conservation covenant provides could be increased, and it certainly could be. So, for example, not that this really happens very often in practice, a conservation covenant does not protect mining for the minerals beneath the surface of the land. And there would be a lot of conservationists, and I would be amongst them, that would say that would be an added strengthening of the conservation covenant. But in itself, that's not going to take away, I don't think, from the federal government recognising those as protected areas. In Australia, it is not going to be possible for Australia to meet its targets under the CBD without protecting private land. There simply won't be enough public land left to meet the requirements for comprehensive, adequate and representative across all of Australia without protecting private land. So our governments are really, I suppose, trying to think about what programs they need to put in place to encourage people to do this. And also for owners of productive lands to be able to start to protect the high quality assets they have on their land as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Victoria. You raised some many very good points there. And it's really a pity that you're not with us here in the room so we can continue the conversation during the breaks. But okay, I got the sign that we run out of time, so unfortunately we have to move on. I can just mention that there were some questions online also, so if you still want to and have the time, feel free to answer them in the chat. And then it's just left to me to wish you a very good night and a good rest of the day to you, Marie-Michèle. And thank you very much for joining us today.